Okay, friends, we're recording. We've said our prayers, and we are ready to begin the discussion of the 23rd chapter of Crucifixion of the King of Glory. And this is called The Road to the Cross. Just for various reasons, I ended up listening to this one a couple of times before I read it. That was actually a very interesting process. When I read it, it was a lot different than when I read it without listening to it first. I actually found out that some people read as they listen. I've never tried that before. But anyway, I was on the road a lot these early days, and I wanted to make sure that I had it down pat. So anyway, I thought that was interesting. And if you get a chance to do that, you might want to do that because really the words jumped out a bit more to me. So let's begin by going around the table here and see if anyone has something that particularly stood out to them. Or that they want to make sure that we talk about before we get off today. So I see Lori has her hand raised. So go ahead, Lori.
At the top of page 230, there's two sentences, and I kind of get it, but it's kind of unclear. And I'm just hoping that you'll talk a little bit about it.
That last paragraph of the chapter?
Page 230 at the very top.
Oh, sorry, that was 231.
Starts with Crucifixion.
Yes, I have all that underlined, and we will definitely be talking about that.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Good. Yeah, I thought that was interesting too. Other things, yeah, Marlene, go ahead.
At the very last paragraph of the chapter, I had been thinking about this before. I'm glad it came up because I need to ask now. So we're talking about Adam's sin brought death to humanity and estrangement from God and the corruption of the created world. So I think this is what the Catholics call the original sin, or based on Adam's original sin.
Go ahead. Sorry.
That's not quite my question. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong about that. But the question is now, if we go back to chapter 21, we were talking about the curse of death, or excuse me, the curse of death is Adam. We go back and we talk about the blood curse. So the Jews tried to put, a curse on themselves and their children, etc. And Chrysostom was shocked by that, and he said that God would never allow that because he loves humanity, and then goes on to say that God will judge each of us individually for whatever wrongs we commit, and the children are not responsible for the sins of their parents. So I see a contradiction there, and if you could discuss that, I'd appreciate it.
Sure, for sure. Anybody have an objection to just jumping off on that one, or does someone have something else that they want to ask or make sure that we talk about? I think that's a very interesting question. So we're talking about personal things like that blood curse. That's a personal issue. Like, does my sin transfer to my kid? And when we're talking about the sin of Adam, we're talking about a corporate thing where the impact is universal. So the concept of original sin has to do more with the kind of corruption of man, as opposed to the implication of Adam's sin on the universe. So before Adam's sin, there was no death. They could have gone for a walk on the bottom of the ocean, whatever. Doesn't matter. They couldn't die. It was impossible. They were eternal. When Adam sinned, then death came into the world, and that changed everything. But that was not the same as a personal, like Adam's sin being imputed to his kid. It's clear that Cain was not someone who attained salvation, whereas Abel was, right? So it wasn't a question of they were both condemned. Cain was condemned, well, because first he killed his brother, but because he also brought an offering to God, which was not from the best of what he had, whereas Abel brought the best, right? He brought his flocks, he brought his animals. So clearly they were not both condemned because of Adam's sin. So yeah, it's a personal, that's a personal thing that we were talking about in chapter 21. Can we condemn our own children by our actions? And the church is real clear about that, that's not possible. But did creation change when Adam sinned? For sure. For sure. Now, original sin means that essentially we are condemned spiritually. That's not an Orthodox teaching. That's kind of like the same thing that we were talking about with the blood curse. It doesn't happen that way. Are we inclined towards sin because of the choices that Adam made, because of death coming into the world, because of our fall, because we are fallen creatures? Sure, we are. Are we not able to be redeemed? No, of course we can be. We can be. Whereas the original sin teaching is essentially that we're essentially almost not even redeemable. Like there's nothing we can do. It fits very nicely with a predetermination. Those that believe that God just chooses some to be saved and some to not be saved. Whereas in the Orthodox Church, it's all about free will. We have our choice. We can choose to be saved or not to be saved. But are we inclined towards sin because of Adam's fall? Sure. More so than we would have been otherwise? Yes. But it doesn't mean that we're cursed, which is like a different level. We're inclined towards sin, but we're not condemned. We have the choice to not follow sin, and we have the choice to repent. Does that help?
It does, yes. I just wonder too, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't ask this right now. I wonder why God, if he loved everybody so much, why and he knows exactly what we're all gonna do. Was it kind of like a big experiment? Like just okay, here you go, just let's see what happens. I mean, he knew what was gonna happen to all of us.
Right. Yeah, he knew what was going to happen. So I think probably rather than an experiment, it was that the Lord saw that somehow this was going to be the best path. That this was the best path for the maximum number of people to attain salvation.
Okay. So he wanted just like you said, the maximum number of people that were created on this earth to be with him.
Right. Because he only created man out of love. There was no other reason. Because God is by definition completely satisfied. He doesn't need anything. He has everything that he needs. So to any act of creation is an act of love, right? It's not he didn't do it for himself. He did it for us. So yeah, and I think that fits in there very nicely. Somehow that fall of Adam must have been something that was best for the maximum number of people to attain salvation.
Okay.
Good.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions like that we want to make sure we get to? We'll get to Lori's too, for sure. I promise. Okay, so let's begin on page 224. So she begins talking about the thing that was on the cross, right? And this should remind us of the sort of interesting kind of cross that we have in the Orthodox Church. We don't have a cross which just looks like a plus sign. Let's see if I can make this go on. Oh, look at that. It's backwards probably, but you can see the little bar on the top of the cross and the little bar on the bottom of the cross. So the one on the bottom, that's where they nailed his feet. And of course, the big one in the middle is where they nailed Christ's hands. But the one on top, that's where they put this titulus, this title board, where Pilate wrote, Jesus Christ, King of the Jews. Okay, so there's a lot going on here, and it's worth it, I think, for us to just take a minute to look at this. So remember that when we last left Pilate and the chief priests, they had essentially blackmailed him into crucifying Jesus, right? So he was not pleased with the situation. As a Roman, he had a kind of like, even though they meted out justice quickly and sometimes very violently, they did believe in justice. They did believe in doing the right thing from that point of view. They were very legalistic people. And so he was not pleased that he had to crucify Jesus, even though he was guilty of no Roman laws. So he was not pleased with that, and he wasn't pleased with the way they sort of threatened him after his sponsor had been considered to be a revolutionary and was killed. for that in Rome. He knew he was in a politically difficult situation, so he was not pleased with the fact that they leveraged that against him, and so he was unhappy, and so he wrote on this board, "This is Jesus Christ, the King of the Jews," and he wrote it in Hebrew and Greek and Latin. So the Jewish leaders were very upset about this. They wanted him to write something like, he called himself King of the Jews or something like that. But see, Pilate is getting back at them there, because he was mocking them and their accusation of treason against Jesus, because he knew that that was untrue. And he knew that they would be very unhappy with him doing this, which is why he did it. And they felt, the Jewish leaders felt that in a way the shame of the cross would be shared with them if Jesus was proclaimed there to be King of the Jews. So it wasn't just a little nothing. And moreover, here again we see, as we often do during this sort of time from Palm Sunday until the Lord's resurrection, that a lot of times, even when someone is mocking him, they end up saying the truth. And it was true that Jesus Christ was King of the Jews. He was King of the world, as God. And so even though Pilate was trying to get back at the Jews, this also expressed the truth that this Jesus was King and God, just as he had been proclaimed when he entered Jerusalem just a few days earlier on the feast that we call Palm Sunday, but really is, strictly speaking, called the entrance into Jerusalem. I thought it was interesting what Augustine wrote about this. He said the three languages showed that Christ would reign not over only the Jews, but also over all the nations, and that not even by killing Christ could they manage to not have him as their king. So that's a very interesting, I think, insight. And you find that repeated about the three languages throughout the fathers. That it showed that Jesus Christ was universal king, not just King of Jews, but universal king. Latin being the language of the empire, the official language, and Greek being the lingua franca of the time. So it was a very universal proclamation that Jesus Christ is King of the Jews in those three languages. So anyway, I thought that was really interesting, and I hope you did too. It's interesting when we talk about Christ's walk to Golgotha with the cross. She says there that we don't know the way that he took. There is definitely a strong tradition. Now, whether that's just a Roman Catholic thing or it's also Orthodox, my guess is probably more Roman Catholic, of the Via Dolorosa in Jerusalem, that Christ walked exactly on this path. And of course, when you go to Jerusalem, you'll walk on that part of the sidewalk. Sidewalk is a funny way to say it. It's not really a road that a vehicle could take. So I guess it is kind of a sidewalk. But in any case, when he walked from the place of his judgment and scourging to outside the city. Now, of course, the Holy Sepulchre, which encompasses both the place where Jesus Christ was crucified and the place where he resurrected, is now inside the city walls. But that was not true at that time. It was outside the city walls at that time. And I think we talked about this last time, that was the common Roman practice, that they would crucify people on the main road which came into a city, so that people would see the crucified there. They'd see the vultures and the animals eating their flesh and so on and so forth, and they would then ideally be in fear enough to be obedient to the Roman power. So in any case, there was the practice of the Romans to make the condemned person carry part of their cross. She points out, and I think this is very interesting, that the average man would not have been able to carry both beams of the cross. It was just too heavy. And Christ even struggled to carry the cross beam. And that's why they grabbed Simon from Cyrenian. We'll talk about that as we get back there a little bit. But in any case, the common practice was to tie the condemned's arms to the cross beam already, but the soldiers would carry the up and down beam because it just was too heavy to be carried. Either way, no matter what path he took, it was about 1/3 of a mile, which should have been a very easy walk with that crossbeam on his shoulders for a young man. And she says, because of that, it shows that he must have been scourged very, very severely, very severely. Surely he had broken ribs. He had nerves which had been, ripped from the place that they were supposed to be in, so he would have been in great pain and probably not able to breathe very easily. She supposes that even the centurion or the soldier, I can't remember the centurion, but the soldier that was in charge to make sure that he was killed, the exactor mortis, very nice Latin name, the one who takes who pulls death from a person or life from a person, would have been concerned that he wouldn't even have been able to get to the cross for crucifixion. And that was a big deal because as we talked about, that whole process of crucifixion, of being mocked, of that being a public spectacle, so on and so forth, of being humiliated, that was all part of the Roman way that they kept power. And so likely the soldier would have been in a lot of trouble if Christ would have died before he was crucified. So very interesting. Now she gets into this thing about the women of Jerusalem, and I thought that was really interesting because many people have probably heard me say that the greatest feminist in the history of the world was Jesus Christ, because before Jesus Christ came, women essentially had the same rights as cattle. I mean, they were treated not really as co-humans. And there is still a question in Judaism about the salvation of women, and also in Islam, by the way. Those are very, very legalistic religions, but that's an interesting point, I think. So this was such a good paragraph, and I think so interesting that we should read the whole thing, so I'll do that. Jesus welcomed women into his circle of disciples, something unheard of at the time. Rabbis did not speak to women in public, not even to their own wives, and they never allowed women to become disciples. Jesus spake to women and treated them with a dignity and value equal to that of men. He even allowed them to follow him as he traveled from place to place. Women disciples were an integral part of his ministry and provided critical financial support. Jesus praised the choice of a woman to sit, listen, and learn as a disciple, and even said that this was better than performing the traditional female duty of preparing and serving meals. And then it goes on more and more to talk about the various situations in which he included women into the group. So I don't think when I say that Jesus Christ was a great feminist, I don't mean that we take this kind of really progressive and often occult concept of femininity, of feminism, and put that on Christ. That's not what I mean. What I'm saying is that the place of women in society took great leaps forward during the time of Christ because he treated them as equal to men regarding salvation, that they could be his disciples, that they could attain salvation just as men could, and so on and so forth. That's what I mean. From a religious point of view, that was the greatest leap forward, I think we can say, ever in the history of women. And that's the most important, because what's the pearl of great price? It's salvation. So but I do usually say that Jesus Christ was the greatest feminist in the history of the world, because especially for teenage girls, that really gets them to listen, and then I can have a greater conversation with them. But I don't think we can argue that from the point of view of there was not one person in the history of the world who had a greater impact on the status of women in society than Jesus Christ. So, like, for instance, he forbade divorce. Okay, well, now someone with a modern sensibility might say, well, that's really oppressive. Well, you have to understand that if a woman was divorced, she was essentially destitute. She couldn't go off and have a career. She was dependent upon her children. If she didn't have children, I mean, she was completely destitute, and she would have to beg in order to live. And essentially, especially during the time of first century Palestine, and even for hundreds of years before that, women could essentially just be cast off by their husbands and divorced. So it was not a like no fault divorce that we think about now, completely different. And so it was a great leap forward that men couldn't just like throw away their wives essentially, and Christ forbade that. So there's a lot of things when we look at it from our modern place. Somebody might say, oh, this or that, but if you understand the reality of the situation, we can see that Christ really improved the situation of women, especially from a spiritual point of view, but also in every other possible metric based on that ancient society. So anyway, I think that's a very, very interesting point. Several very interesting points there about how rabbis wouldn't even talk to their wives in public, and yet Christ preached to women on a regular basis, and they had a very important part in his ministry, both in financing that ministry, but also in participating in that. So also interesting little point. It was not the apostles who found that Christ was risen. It was Mary Magdalene, right? So just very interesting little pieces there where it's obviously God's will that women be looked at not as they in perpetuity, not as they were in the first century or in the previous centuries, but that women would have a much more equal place in salvation than had been previously understood. So why does Jesus tell the women to weep for themselves and for their children? It's because he's talking to them about the coming war that will take place when the temple is destroyed, and essentially the whole city of Jerusalem almost was destroyed during the Jewish war of 66 to 73. And that there was a very large siege of Jerusalem, and it was a really terrible situation. Many people starved. And those who didn't starve were, when the Romans finally broke in there, they would crucify them and, just do terrible things, or even worse, send them to the mines, which was considered to be a fate worse than death. So this is what he was talking about when he said, weep for yourself and for your children. Okay, so we get to Simon the Cyrenian. So that's a Cyrenius, I think that's what it is called, was a Roman province in modern day Libya. Let me see if I can figure out exactly what it was called, but I'm pretty sure that's what it was called. Anyway, something like that. So that's why he had that name. And there were a lot of Jews there who had moved there several hundred years before out of the area around Jerusalem, but they had a synagogue. There's enough of them that they had their own synagogue in Jerusalem. So what I found really interesting here was two things. First of all, centurions had the right to compel labor upon those that were the captive population. So the Romans had no issues with a centurion who would have been maybe like a captain in today's army, had 100 soldiers under him. Yeah, a lieutenant probably wouldn't have that many. So like a captain, he was an officer in the Roman army, and he had the right to compel those who were captive by Rome, like the Jews, to compel them to do labor just on the spot. And so it looked like Christ was having trouble carrying the cross, and so he compelled this Simon Cyrene to carry that. Now, she points out that because he's mentioned by name, it's almost certain that he became a Christian, although it's even more certain that his children did and were known by St. Mark the Evangelist's community because he names them by name, and he mentions that he's their father. So that's an interesting point, I think, which can be helpful as we try to decipher the details of these Gospels. When someone is named like that, it probably means that the evangelist knew that person, or at least the evangelist's kind of group, his community, knew that person. So I thought that was quite interesting, actually. And then she takes a paragraph to talk about Gnosticism and how the one group of Gnostics would claim in the future that Jesus was never crucified, and it was Simon. But it doesn't fit the Roman practice. They always scourged the people before they crucified them. Simon was not scourged. And for those who don't know about Gnosticism, it's essentially a teaching that there is some secret some secret teachings about Christianity that not everyone is privy to, that allow a person to attain the heavenly kingdom. So the church this was the first kind of big heresy in the church, this idea that there was secret knowledge that could not be known by everyone, but only by a select few who would then attain salvation because of it. So the church is absolutely anti-Gnostic. It's completely the opposite. There is no secret teachings. We do have these things called silent prayers that in our present usage are read silently in the altar or quietly in the altar by the priests. Sometimes that's translated as secret prayers, which is a very bad translation of tajnia molitwy, which does not mean secret in Slavonic. It does in Russian, but not in Slavonic. It means quiet prayers. So there was a time in the church when those were read out loud. But the church is alive, and it changes over time. The Holy Spirit guides it, and at this present time, those prayers are not read out loud. But there was a time when they were. In any case, now they are called quiet prayers, and some people think they're secret prayers, and nobody's allowed to know them. Everybody can read them. There's no one is keeping anyone from anything. There is no secret knowledge in Christianity. Everything is open. Everything is available to every person, and that's perfectly fair. That's the way that it's supposed to be. So anyway, I just wanted to take a second to talk about Gnosticism, about that, and because she spends some time talking about that. If you ever look at a timeline of church history, you'll see the first break off from the main sort of trunk of the tree is Gnosticism. Okay, now let's get to this part on the top of page 230 that Lori pointed out in the beginning. Chrysostom interprets Jesus dying outside the city in the open air as pointing to the sanctification of the entire world and the fact that worship of the Lord would no longer be confined to one place. For we are able in every place to lift holy hands, since the whole earth has become holy, holier than the holies inside. Inside the temple is what he's referring to there. So it's a real interesting quote, but I think we need to break down a little bit what he's talking about here. So Christ is crucified in the open air. It means he's using this as a dichotomy to Christ being inside the city walls of Jerusalem, crucified. He's crucified outside the city walls. Jerusalem has a special kind of meaning as the heavenly city. And so there's a definite, like, inside Jerusalem and then the whole rest of the world. And so what he's pointing out is that because Christ was crucified outside, this shows that his ministry was to the whole world, and that we don't have to just worship God in one place, like at the temple in Jerusalem, but God came for everyone in every place, and therefore he can be worshipped in every place by everyone. So that's a really important dichotomy as we transition here, unquestionably, with Christ's crucifixion and resurrection from the Old Testament to the New. We can kind of argue ad nauseum about when is that exact point, when we're no longer in the Old Testament and now we're in the New Testament. I think as good as any is when the temple curtain rips in two, showing that the Holy of Holies no longer has any meaning, that God is no longer confined to this space. So, but you could argue other times Christ is born, Mother of God is born, Christ is baptized. I mean, you can argue ad nauseum about this, but usually what I've seen from the fathers is that destruction of the temple curtain, and wait till we read about that. There's a lot more to that than what you probably think. That is kind of the inflection point where we move from the Old Testament. Unquestionably, we have left the Old Testament at that point, and we are in a new testament. We are in a new sort of gathering that is not the Old Testament anymore. So anyway, that's, I think, very interesting. Lori, does that begin to answer your question, or perhaps just made it that much more complicated?
No, absolutely. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, and then the rest of the short chapter is dedicated to Golgotha. As I mentioned previously, both Golgotha and the Holy Sepulchre, place of the Lord's resurrection, are under one roof, which is the contemporary Church of the Holy Sepulchre. I say contemporary because when Saint Helen built it at the time of the finding of the cross and so on and so forth, it was significantly bigger than it is now. Then it was essentially destroyed and rebuilt. And when it was rebuilt, I think it was the Persians who destroyed it. I don't remember who destroyed it. I don't want to say the wrong vandalist group. But in any case, somebody invaded and destroyed it. And when it was rebuilt much smaller. So within the Holy Sepulchre, the sort of major pieces that you will get to experience when the war ends and we can begin to have pilgrimages again, God willing, that could even be like this summer, I suppose, if things go well. You will find the place of the Lord's resurrection. You will find Golgotha. You will find the place where, after having been taken down from the cross, Christ was anointed and prepared for burial, which is kind of halfway between Golgotha and the Holy Sepulchre. I mean, literally, like in the middle of those two things. You will find the place where the cross was found. Those are the major pieces. Marlene, what am I missing? Anything?
Not that I can think of at the moment.
Yeah, I think those are at least the major pieces. So you kind of have the Holy Sepulchre is on one end, the place where the cross was found is on the other end. A little bit this way is Golgotha. A little bit this way is the place where Christ was taken down from the cross and prepared for burial. And then we get to his place of resurrection, which is also the place of his burial, obviously. Liturgy is served at all of those places except the place where he was anointed. I don't think that they do that there, but what you might not know about the Holy Sepulchre is it is a shared space. It is a shared space between the Orthodox, the Roman Catholics, and the Armenians, the Monophysites. So the Orthodox serve at the Holy Sepulchre every Sunday. I'm not sure if anybody else serves there, honestly, but there are like Catholic chapels and Armenian chapels around, and that place where the cross was found is a Catholic chapel there. So when we would go with Archbishop Peter on pilgrimage, that's where we would say our pre-communion prayers. Liturgy is at midnight. The liturgies in the Holy Sepulchre are generally at midnight, at least at the Holy Sepulchre itself, the place of the Lord's resurrection. And so we would go there 9:30 or 10 o'clock, something like that. Then they would actually lock the place. We'd be locked in. We'd go down to the place where the cross was found, say our prayers, and then people had quite a bit of time to be able to pray at Golgotha or at that place where the cross was found, or even at the Holy Sepulchre during that time. So that was always very nice, the opportunity to do that. Not everybody got that. That was a special Archbishop Peter blessing that we'll try to continue, God willing, when we go back. Go ahead, Lori, you have your hands up.
Yeah, just curious, why were you locked in?
They lock it at, I want to say 10 o'clock. It might be 11. I don't remember. I think 10.
I remember it being 2 hours, Father.
2 hours? Okay, so must have been.
So. It was awesome.
Yeah, so we must have got there like 9:30, I guess. And at 10 o'clock they close it because they clean it, Lori. They clean it and get it ready for the midnight liturgy. And then I guess they must open the doors around 11:30. And there are no preparatory services, I don't think. Probably those were held like way earlier in the evening. I recall that it's just liturgy. So yeah, and I recall that when we were there, I very thankfully was issued a vestment so I could serve. And then I took my place at the very end of the line, and I was very happy there, just being able to pray and quietly, participate in the liturgy. There were a couple of bishops serving, I don't remember. Anyway, the archdeacon comes to me like after the small entrance. He's like, I can't talk to these people. We don't have a common language. There's a ton of Ukrainians there. from a ton of Ukrainians there. So he picked me up there and put me like second in line with the priest. And I translated the whole service between the archdeacon and all the Ukrainian deacons. So that was exciting. Not at all what I had planned on, but man proposes and God disposes, I guess. So that's what it was. Yeah. So what's that?
Very good.
Well, very good. I don't know. I was chuckling about that. And we won't talk about the fight that broke out there also, but it's Holy Sepulchre is a little different place from that point of view. I thought it was interesting, the little talk about Golgotha and the skull of Adam. So there's the tradition is that is where Adam was buried, and that is where Christ was crucified. And so can we prove that? Of course we can't prove that. But that's the tradition. And it's a pretty strong tradition in the Orthodox Church. I don't know if the Catholics have that tradition or not, but it's pretty strong in the Orthodox Church. Like if you look at most priests' crosses, there's no way you're going to see the detail here, but at the base of the cross where Christ is crucified, there is always the skull of Adam. You can see it a little bit better on like the cross that Father Colin wears or Father Vladimir wears, those silver crosses that you're ordained with. They show that much more clearly. Adam's skull. So the point is that this expresses the deeper theological and spiritual meaning of Christ's accomplishment, reversing the curse of death that Adam had brought upon mankind, and again making it possible for mankind to attain the heavenly kingdom. Because from the time of Adam, angel with the fiery sword was posted in front of paradise. There was no going back, and all of those who died from Adam until Christ's resurrection, they were waiting in Sheol, which is a dark place. It's not the hell of Bugs Bunny and Tom and Jerry where there's fire and brimstone and devils with pitchforks. There's a dark place. And it was really like, we say that Florida is God's waiting room, but it was really like God's waiting room. They were waiting for the Messiah to come into the world. And by the time that this all happens, surely they all knew that he was there because St. John the Baptist had been killed some months before. And we can assume that because he was not able to be quiet about true spiritual things in this life, that he also wasn't there, and that he had preached to all of them that the Messiah was in the world. But we'll get to that when we get to Holy Saturday. So St. John Chrysostom's quote in this regard is, "Some say that there Adam had died and lay buried, and that Jesus set up his trophy over death in the place where death had begun its rule. He went forth carrying his cross as a trophy in opposition to the tyranny of death, and, as it is customary with conquerors, he also carried on his shoulders the symbol of his victory." So that carrying things that are symbols of victory is very Roman, very, very Roman. That was their big thing. They would go conquer some people, and they would bring back to Rome gold and slaves and art and everything, and they'd have like this big parade and carry all that stuff, and it would be like for the great glory of the general or whatever. Remember, Rome was about glory and honor, right? So that was a big deal for them. So he's referring to that when he's talking about a conqueror carrying on his shoulders the symbol of his victory. So Adam's sin brought death to humanity, estrangement from God, and the corruption of the created world. Now the second Adam, that's Jesus Christ, would ascend the cross, reversing the effects of Adam's fall, bringing life and sanctification not only to the human race, but to all of creation. But to accomplish this great mystery, Jesus would have to endure an agonizing ordeal beyond our comprehension, and that's when we get to the next chapter, which is about crucifixion. So let's see how long, because I haven't looked at it. Might be a long one, actually. Kind of thinking it is. Which is okay, as long as we have, that's not bad. 232 to 246, so 14, 15 pages. That's not bad. Okay, good. And we will plan to have that meeting next week. What did we decide about Lent? I think we decided to do Tuesday nights, right? Who can remind me?
I don't know that you decided, but I'm good with either Tuesday or Thursday. I think you said Thursday was a little more iffy for you.
Thursday's bad for us because we do liturgy on Friday morning too, so we do matins and all the hours on Thursday night, so that people could just come to liturgy on Friday morning. So that's sketchy for us. I think, really, frankly speaking, the only decent day is Tuesday for Great Lent. So I think that's why we have to choose it, because that's all we have. Every other single day, we've got something going on. Monday or Tuesday are free, and Monday is hypothetically curious, Vlad, although that doesn't always happen. So let's plan for Tuesday for Great Lent. But next week we'll do Wednesday. That first Tuesday, I assume that I took it off. I don't remember what I put on the syllabus, but I would think that I would do that because everybody's got services on
You
the.
said no class.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So we'll have class this coming week, and we'll talk about chapter 24. Then we'll take a break, and we'll get on to chapter 25. And I think that the parts that we will go over in Great Lent will be especially important because we're getting closer here to the crucifixion and to the Lord's resurrection. And of course, we'll be doing that in Great Lent also. So I think there'll be a really strong kind of cooperation here between what we're reading and what we are experiencing in the church. At least that was the hypothetical idea. So let's hope that works out. Go ahead, Lori.
So March 12th, when we do chapters 25 and 26, we will do that on Tuesdays. Is that when you want to start?
Yes.
Tuesdays?
Yes. So beginning with March 12th, we'll really do March 11th.
March 11th? Oh, yes.
Yeah, that's the Tuesday.
Sorry.
So I'll try to revise the syllabus and send it out, but we'll plan to do Tuesdays for Great Lent. That'll work on all of those days. My guess is I also took off the Holy Week because, again, we would expect that everybody's at church that day. Okay, any other questions or comments or concerns or anything else that begins with a word like with a letter like C?
Thank you.
Okay, so I thought that was an interesting chapter. I hope you did, and I think this next one is going to be interesting too. I didn't read it yet. I'm remembering from when I listened to it. She talks a lot about the physiological processes of what's happening with the crucifixion, which on one hand, you think, well, that's going to be like some overkill. And on one hand it is, but on the other hand, it's actually quite interesting to kind of understand that because Christ is completely God and completely man, right? So it's good for us to understand the reality of this. And as she said in a previous chapter, maybe the last chapter, there's not a lot of great detailed explanations of what happened during someone's crucifixion. People were afraid of it, and everybody kind of understood that this was something bad. So there's not a lot of information about it during that time when it was practiced. You'll see in the next chapter that there's a lot of suppositions that people in the, especially 18th and 19th century, made about how Christ died, like the physiological process. But a lot of that turns out to be rather specious. In any case, it's a pretty interesting chapter. And even if you're feeling like, wow, this is like too much information, don't worry about that. That it will not be too much information after you're done. Like when we go through Holy Week, you won't remember all of those details. You'll just be like, okay, that this was way worse than I ever imagined that it was. And that's probably just the message as Orthodox Christians that we want to understand. So anyway, I hope that's helpful. So I'm looking forward to meeting you all next Wednesday, and then we'll take that Wednesday off for the first week of Great Lent. So let's say a prayer, and then we'll say good night. It is truly me to bless thee, the Theotokos, ever blessed and most blameless, and Mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, and beyond compare more glorious than the seraphim, who without corruption gave us birth to God, the word, the very Theotokos, be to magnify. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Father.
Have a good evening.
You too.
Well.